6 men saw a royal guard walking alone toward his post. They followed him, laughing, shouting, slurring insults. They mocked his silence, mocked his country, mocked everything they thought he stood for. And when he didn't respond, they took that silence as weakness. So they charged him, all 6, at once. But what happened next wasn't a scuffle. It wasn't a fight. It was a correction. Because within 60 seconds, they weren't laughing anymore. They were on the pavement, gasping, groaning, cuffed, and suddenly very, very quiet. But before we show you exactly how discipline broke the mob, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning sun had that particular London quality that makes everything look like a postcard. Soft light bouncing off the ancient stones of Horse Guards Parade, turning the scarlet tunics of the guards into something that seems almost too perfect to be real. The kind of light that makes American tourists stop mid-sentence and reach for their cameras, convinced they've stumbled into a movie set. It was just past 10 o'clock, and the square was already alive with that familiar tourist energy. A German family was comparing guidebooks near the main archway, their teenage daughter rolling her eyes as her parents debated whether to buy another souvenir mug. Somewhere across the parade ground, a street musician's accordion drifted through the morning air, mixing with the soft chatter of pensioners sharing thermoses of tea and families debating which pub to hit for lunch. Near the ceremonial barriers, a young boy in a Manchester United jersey kept inching closer to his mother, working up the courage to wave at one of the guards. "Mum, do you think he can see me?" he whispered, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. His mother smiled, that patient parent smile. "Of course he can see you, love, but he's not allowed to wave back. That's part of his job." "But what if he wants to?" Standing perfectly motionless beneath the morning sun, Lance Corporal Thomas Ward had heard that exact conversation 1,000 times before. The scarlet tunic pressed to perfection, bearskin cap sitting tall and precise, rifle gripped diagonally across his chest, in that textbook stance that takes years to master without your shoulders cramping. To everyone taking selfies and debating the best camera angle, he was just another piece of British pageantry. Like Big Ben or those red phone boxes that nobody actually uses anymore. A living statue in a funny hat, paid to stand still while tourists posed beside him. But here's what those families sharing ice cream didn't know about the man standing so perfectly still in that uniform. Thomas was 32 years old, with 12 years of service in the Grenadier Guards. 4 of those years had been spent in Helmand Province, the kind of deployment that doesn't make headlines, but teaches you things about holding your ground that no parade drill ever could. He'd pulled 2 wounded corporals out of a collapsed compound, while Taliban fighters were still moving through the surrounding hills. Got a piece of shrapnel in his right knee, and a commendation he never talked about. The discipline that kept him motionless for hours wasn't just ceremonial training. It was forged in observation posts where he'd held overwatch positions for 16-hour shifts while insurgents probed the perimeter below, where moving at the wrong moment could compromise not just your position, but the lives of every soldier, depending on your vigilance. His right knee still twinged on cold mornings, a reminder of that convoy ambush back in 2012 when everything went sideways in the space of 30 seconds. But out here, on duty, in uniform, none of that showed. He was ageless, unmoving, unreadable. To the crowd snapping photos, though, he was just part of the scenery. That was about to change. Because across the square near the service road, where no civilian vehicles were supposed to stop, a battered white van had just pulled up with the kind of aggressive confidence that makes security personnel reach for their radios. The engine shut off with a diesel cough, and you could hear voices inside, loud, slurred, already working themselves up to something. "There's one of them," came a voice from inside the van, standing there like he owns the place. "Bet he don't even speak English," another replied, followed by harsh laughter. The van doors slammed open. Out stepped 6 men who moved like they owned whatever space they entered. Early 30s maybe, some in denim jackets, others shirtless under open hoodies despite the morning chill. Empty lager cans glinted in a few hands, though it wasn't even 11 o'clock yet. They weren't here for the ceremony. One had a shaved head and tattoos that spelled out messages you don't usually see in tourist areas. Another wore a faded T-shirt with England First printed across the chest in cracked black letters. The tallest one, lean build, scar running down his jawline like an old argument, surveyed the square with the calculating eye of someone looking for trouble. But it was the conversation that followed that told you everything you needed to know about their intentions. "Right then," the scarred one said, loud enough for the nearest tourists to hear. "Let's see what these toy soldiers are really made of." "My mate Gary says they can't do nothing," another chimed in, already stumbling slightly. "Just stand there and take whatever you give them. It's the rules." "Rules!" the first one spat. "Bunch of dress-up nonsense while real English lads can't find work." Thomas was still 50 yards away, walking steadily toward his post, but his peripheral vision had already catalogued the group. 6 males, intoxicated, aggressive posturing, positioning themselves to intercept his path. In Helmand, this kind of tactical awareness had kept him alive through 18 months of patrol duty. "Oi! Look at this statue come to life," the scarred one called out, his voice carrying that particular kind of aggressive cheer that makes crowds instinctively take a step back. Thomas kept walking toward his post, eyes forward, boots falling in steady rhythm against the ancient stones. "What's the matter?" another shouted, trailing lager fumes and yesterday's cigarettes. "Too posh to look at the public?" A ripple of nervous laughter from the group. The tourists nearby started glancing at each other with that universal expression that says, maybe we should find somewhere else to take our photos. A middle-aged woman with a guidebook whispered to her husband, "Should we call someone?" But the nearest police constable was clear across the square, dealing with a bicycle theft report. "Look at him," one of the men said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Thinks he's better than us. Thinks that fancy uniform makes him special." But Thomas didn't break stride, shoulders back, chin level, rifle steady. He'd heard worse in places where the people shouting actually had weapons and the legal authority to use them. Behind them, a tour guide was trying to keep her small group of elderly visitors focused on the history lesson. The tradition of the Queen's Guard dates back to 1656, she was saying, but her voice had that strained quality of someone trying to pretend everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. The 6 men crossed from the van toward Thomas's path, their voices following like a pack of dogs that had caught an interesting scent. "Bet you lot stand around like mannequins while the country burns," one of them jeered, stumbling slightly as he tried to match Thomas's pace. "Yeah, go on then. Stand at attention for all the immigrants you serve now." That drew louder laughter from the group, though the tourists around them had gone quiet. A mother with a stroller whispered to her husband, "This doesn't feel right. Maybe we should go." Still Thomas walked. The insults grew filthier, invoking the royal family with crude jabs about bloodlines and treason and how the empire was gone because you lot got soft. But his breathing remained steady, his grip on the rifle unchanged. What the crowd couldn't see was the mental calculation taking place behind that ceremonial mask. Thomas was automatically assessing angles of approach, potential weapons, civilian positions. The tallest one had a slight limp, old injury, probably. The one with the England First shirt kept touching his right pocket, possibly carrying something. The youngest of the group was filming with his phone, which meant this was planned, not spontaneous. He was trained for this. Silence was protocol, stillness was power, but even power had limits. Near the ceremonial rope that marked his post, Thomas slowed to take his position. The morning crowd parted slightly, most sensing that whatever was building here wasn't part of the usual tourist experience. And still, the 6 men followed. One broke formation first, skipping ahead to cut across Thomas's path, then turning to march backward with exaggerated stiffness, arms flailing in a mock goose step. "Hup, hup! Eyes front, soldier boy!" he barked, nearly colliding with an elderly woman who clutched her walking stick and muttered something about proper respect. An American father pulled his young daughter closer, "Daddy, why are those men being mean to the soldier?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Some people don't understand respect." But the daughter, maybe 6 years old, kept staring at Thomas with wide eyes. Even at that age, she could sense the difference between someone pretending to ignore you and someone who was choosing not to respond. There was power in that stillness that even a child could recognize. The comments turned uglier. Racial slurs mixed with anti-immigration rants, wartime propaganda twisted into venom. The kind of language Thomas hadn't heard shouted in public since Kandahar, where at least the people saying it were honest about wanting to kill you. "Come on then," the scarred leader taunted, circling closer. "Say something. Prove you're not just another pretty puppet." A teenage girl near the rope barrier started filming with her phone, her hands shaking slightly. "This isn't right," she whispered to her friend. "Someone should stop them." But who? The palace stewards were trained for crowd control, not confrontation. The nearest armed police were inside the building. The tourists weren't about to intervene in something that was rapidly escalating beyond verbal harassment. That left Thomas, standing perfectly still, while 6 grown men circled him like wolves, their voices getting louder, their movements more aggressive, testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. But here's what they didn't understand about the man they were taunting. In Forward Operating Base Price, Thomas had learned to distinguish between actual threats and noise. Taliban fighters would sometimes spend hours shouting propaganda and insults over loudspeakers, trying to provoke British forces into breaking discipline and responding from fortified positions. The soldiers who lasted were the ones who could tell the difference between psychological warfare and genuine danger. These 6 weren't Taliban, but the principle was the same. Words were just noise until they became actions. And then one of them crossed the line that couldn't be crossed. The scarred leader stepped directly into Thomas's personal space, close enough that his breath fogged in the cool air between them. "Make me stop," he whispered, just loud enough for the nearest cameras to catch. His eyes had that flat look of someone who'd convinced himself he was untouchable. Then he reached for Thomas's rifle. Not grabbing it outright, just trailing his fingers along the bayonet scabbard, slow and deliberate, testing, daring, making it clear this wasn't accidental contact. "Oi, mate," he said louder now, playing to the crowd. "This thing even loaded, or is it just another prop?" In that instant, everything changed. Not because Thomas lost control, but because he found it. The rifle wasn't just ceremonial equipment. It was the line that couldn't be crossed. Every guard knew it. Every security protocol emphasized it. Touch a royal guard's weapon, and you weren't dealing with ceremony anymore. You were dealing with a soldier. The moment those fingers made contact with the rifle, Thomas's mind shifted into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through convoy ambushes and compound raids. Multiple threats, civilian area, restricted movement options. He'd trained for scenarios exactly like this. What happened next wasn't dramatic, wasn't telegraphed. There was no Hollywood wind-up, no dramatic pause for effect. There was just the sudden, precise application of 12 years' worth of military training delivered with surgical accuracy. The man's fingers were still curled around the weapon when Thomas's left hand snapped up, seizing his wrist and applying pressure to the nerve cluster just below the palm. It's called a come-along hold, designed to control without causing permanent damage, but devastatingly effective when applied correctly. The scarred man's knees buckled, and he hit the cobblestones with a sound like a dropped sack of grain. Before the first gasp could escape from the crowd, Thomas had already pivoted toward the second threat. Another man was lunging forward, fist cocked back, face twisted with rage and disbelief. But anger makes you predictable, and Thomas had been trained to exploit predictability. He sidestepped the wild swing, caught the man's wrist mid-flight, and used his own momentum to send him tumbling across the ancient stones. Classic judo, minimum effort, maximum effect. The attacker's shoulder hit the pavement first, followed by the rest of him in a graceless sprawl. The third attacker tried to grab Thomas from behind in a bear hug, probably thinking he could restrain him while the others regrouped. Big mistake. Thomas had learned in urban combat training that the best way to deal with someone grabbing you from behind is to make them regret it immediately. He drove his elbow backward into the man's solar plexus. Not wild, not emotional, just a precise strike that folded him like a broken umbrella. 3 down in less than 15 seconds. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Phones were still recording, but nobody was cheering or gasping. They were witnessing something they'd never seen before. Controlled violence, professional and precise. The remaining 3 attackers froze, suddenly realizing they weren't dealing with a tourist attraction in a funny hat. They were facing someone who moved like he'd done this before, in places where getting it wrong meant not coming home. "Jesus," one of them whispered, backing away with his hands raised. "He's not ceremonial. He's the real thing." But the fourth man was too drunk or too stupid to read the situation. He tried to rush Thomas head on, screaming incoherently, rage masking the dawning fear in his eyes. Thomas didn't retreat. He stepped into the charge, ducked under the wild haymaker, and caught the man's belt from behind. A swift twist of the hips, and the attacker went airborne for a split second before landing flat on his back, legs splayed, staring up at the London sky with the stunned expression of someone who'd just learned something important about the difference between ceremony and capability. The last 2 tried to run. They turned and bolted, not in formation, not with any kind of plan, just raw panic. But Thomas was already moving, not running, not chasing, just walking with that same steady military pace, fast enough to stay in control of the situation. The younger one tripped at the edge of the pavement, scrambling on his hands and knees toward the van. Before he could rise, Thomas was there, placing one boot firmly but gently on the man's ankle, not enough to injure, but enough to freeze him in place. "Please," the man gasped, all his earlier bravado gone. I didn't mean..." But Thomas said nothing, just maintained pressure until the man went completely still. The 6th man, the one with the England first shirt, kept running until he realized the crowd wasn't parting for him anymore. They were watching, some filming, some whispering, but none helping him escape. He slowed, turned to look over his shoulder, and there was Thomas, still walking, still calm, still holding his rifle like it had never been touched. The man raised his hands and sank slowly to his knees on the cobblestones. "I surrender," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I surrender." From first contact to final submission, 60 seconds had elapsed. 6 grown men, all now flat on the pavement or kneeling in surrender. And Thomas Ward was already adjusting his grip on his rifle, preparing to return to his post. The silence that followed was unlike anything the square had ever experienced. Not the respectful quiet of a ceremony, but the stunned hush of people processing something they'd never expected to witness. Then, slowly, the crowd erupted. Not wild cheering, but that kind of amazed applause you get when people have just seen something they didn't know was possible. The sound built and spread, carrying with it a mixture of relief, awe, and newfound respect. A woman near the barrier turned to her husband, her voice hushed with disbelief. "Did that guard just—" "Yes," he nodded, still staring at Thomas's motionless form. "He did." The boy in the Manchester United jersey grabbed his mother's arm. "Mum, did you see how fast he moved? That wasn't pretend." His mother, who'd been explaining just minutes earlier how the guards weren't allowed to move, found herself struggling for words. "No, love. That was real. That was very real." Near them, an elderly gentleman in a veteran's cap stepped closer to the rope barrier. He'd done his national service back when it meant something, had seen real soldiers in action during the Falklands. That's what proper training looks like, he said to anyone within earshot. Not the Hollywood stuff, the real thing, controlled aggression. The little girl who'd asked her father about the mean men was now staring at Thomas with something approaching wonder. Daddy, is he a superhero? Her father considered the question carefully. No, sweetheart, he's something better. He's a professional. For a moment, the 6 men just lay there, groaning, stunned, trying to figure out what had hit them. The scarred leader who'd started it all propped himself up on one elbow, his earlier swagger completely gone, replaced by something that might have been the first dawning of genuine respect. "What the hell?" he muttered, cradling his wrist. Around him, his companions were in similar states of bewildered defeat. One was trying to sit up, wincing with each movement. Another had rolled onto his side and was staring at Thomas with something approaching awe. "I thought they were just for show," he whispered. "Yeah," the scarred man said quietly, his voice carrying none of its earlier aggression. "So did I." The one who'd tried to run was still on his knees, hands raised, looking around as if he couldn't quite believe where he was. "Gary said they couldn't touch us," he mumbled. "Said it was against the rules." "Gary's an idiot," the scarred man replied, still nursing his wrist. "We all are." But nobody was looking at them anymore. All eyes were on Thomas, who had calmly walked back to his ceremonial position and resumed his perfect military bearing. Same spot, same posture, same forward stare, like nothing had happened at all. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air, not distant, but close, very close. Metropolitan Police units that had been monitoring the square through CCTV and had dispatched the moment the confrontation began. 3 police officers rounded the corner with that particular kind of efficiency that makes smart people start cooperating immediately. The lead officer, a woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone who'd seen enough to know when something was worth her personal attention, absorbed the scene in one sweep. The scattered attackers, the applauding crowd, the perfectly positioned guard who hadn't moved from his post. She approached Thomas first, stopping just outside the traditional respect distance. "Corporal!" Thomas's eyes shifted down briefly. "Ma'am." "Any injuries?" "None, ma'am. Still fit for duty." She nodded once, a professional acknowledgement between people who understood what had just happened. "Witnesses confirm you acted in self-defense. Multiple camera angles, clear evidence of weapon contact. You're in the clear." "Thank you, ma'am." She turned to her colleagues and who were already helping the 6 men to their feet. "Right then, let's process this lot and get statements from witnesses." As the officers began their work, zip-tie restraints appearing with practiced efficiency, rights being read in calm, professional voices, more details of the incident started emerging from the crowd. The teenage girl who'd been filming approached one of the officers, her phone in hand. "I got it all, officer. From the moment they got out of the van, you can see everything they did." An American tourist stepped forward as well. "I was recording too. These men were harassing him for at least 10 minutes before anything physical happened." The veteran in the cap walked over to the lead officer. "That soldier showed remarkable restraint," he said quietly. "Could have put all 6 in hospital if he'd wanted to. Instead, he used exactly the force necessary to neutralize the threat. Textbook response." One of the attackers, the youngest, still shaking from adrenaline, looked up at the officer processing him. "Is he going to be in trouble? The guard, I mean." The officer studied him for a moment. "Son, that man just taught you and your mates a lesson about the difference between ceremony and combat capability. If I were you, I'd spend less time worrying about him and more time thinking about how you're going to explain this to the magistrate." As the 6 men were loaded into 2 separate transport vehicles, their earlier bravado had completely evaporated. They moved like people who'd just learned something fundamental about the world and about themselves. The scarred leader, hands cuffed behind his back, paused as he was helped into the van. He looked back at Thomas, still standing at perfect attention, and shook his head slowly. 12 years I've been picking fights, he said to the officer beside him. Never met anyone like that. That's because you've never picked a fight with a real soldier before, the officer replied. Today's your lucky day. You get to walk away from the experience. Within 20 minutes, Horse Guards Parade had returned to something approaching normal. The scuff marks had been swept away. The rope barriers were straight. The 6 men were gone, processed through whatever system handles people who mistake ceremony for weakness. But the atmosphere had completely changed. Where before there had been casual tourist chatter and the kind of mild disrespect that comes from thinking something is just for show, now there was something closer to reverence. People weren't just taking pictures anymore, they were really looking, understanding that they were in the presence of something genuine. The crowd had grown too. Word was spreading through the square and beyond it, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant. Text messages were flying across London and beyond, carrying the same basic message. You need to see this. These guards aren't what we thought they were. A news reporter had arrived, but she wasn't pushing for interviews or shouting questions. She stood at the edge of the crowd, taking notes, understanding that some stories tell themselves better without commentary. The boy in the Manchester United jersey finally worked up the courage he'd been building all morning. But instead of the casual wave he'd planned, he stood as straight as his 8-year-old frame would allow and gave Thomas a perfect salute. Thomas didn't move, couldn't move, but his eyes, those same steady eyes that hadn't flinched when 6 men surrounded him, shifted just slightly toward the boy. And for a moment, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't watching closely, his gaze softened. He saw the salute. He acknowledged it. He respected it. And that was enough. The little girl who'd asked about superheroes tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can I salute him too?" Her father lifted her up so she could see over the crowd. She raised her small hand to her forehead, wobbling slightly but determined. Around them, other children started doing the same. Then teenagers. Then adults. Within minutes, dozens of people were standing in respectful silence, some saluting, others simply paying their respects to someone they'd finally realized deserved them. Thomas couldn't acknowledge them all. Protocol forbade it. But somehow they all understood that their respect had been received and returned in the only way he was allowed to give it. Through the dignity of his bearing, the perfection of his discipline, the quiet strength that needed no words. As the London sun climbed higher and the morning crowd continued to grow, one truth settled over the square like a benediction. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply stands ready. And when the moment comes, when someone crosses that line and forces your hand, it responds with exactly the precision the situation demands. No more, no less, just enough. Because that's what discipline really looks like. Not the absence of power, but the perfect control of it. Not the inability to act, but the wisdom to know exactly when action is necessary and when it isn't. Lance Corporal Thomas Ward had stood perfectly still while 6 men surrounded him, tested him, challenged him. He'd absorbed their insults, ignored their provocations, maintained his composure even when they invaded his personal space. But the moment one of them touched his weapon, crossed that final line, he'd responded with 12 years of military training delivered in 60 seconds of surgical precision. And then he'd returned to his post like nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing had. He'd simply done his job. The job wasn't just to look ceremonial, it was to hold the line, even when, especially when, people thought that line didn't exist. Later that day, the 6 men would be processed through the justice system. Some would receive fines, others community service. The ringleader would spend a night in custody, nursing his bruised wrist and his bruised ego. But the real punishment had already been delivered. Not through violence, but through the devastating efficiency with which their assumptions about strength and weakness had been corrected. They'd mistake ceremony for passivity, discipline for weakness, silence for inability. And they'd learned, in the most direct way possible, that real power doesn't need to shout. It simply waits for the moment when shouting isn't enough. Then it moves with precision that takes your breath away. Have you ever watched someone stay silent in the face of pure hatred, right up until silence wasn't enough? Do you think those 6 men learned something that day they'll carry for the rest of their lives? And what would you have done if you'd been there watching it all unfold? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one of them, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story showed you something about what real strength looks like, if it made you see ceremonial soldiers in a completely different light, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable men and women behind these ancient traditions. And if you know someone who still thinks the guards are just for show, share this video with them. Let them see for themselves what 60 seconds of perfect discipline really looks like when it finally decides to move. And your next Royal Guard story is waiting on your screen right now. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply stands ready. And when it finally moves, the whole world stops to watch.